This is Talk of the Devils, the athletic show dedicated to Manchester United. And this is an emergency podcast because Ruben Amorim departed his role as Manchester United's head coach at 10:15 Monday morning UK time. Under 18 coach Darren Fletcher is going to take over as the interim. Ian Irving's still away, so it's me, Carl Anker, as your host. I've got Andy Mitten with me. I've got Laurie Whitwell with me. We have a lot to go through in a very short period of time. Gentlemen, how are you?
I'm good, yes. Yes, good, I think is the right word. Frazzled a little bit, to be honest. Phone obviously has been going pretty wild. Obviously had a few late night phone calls after we recorded our last podcast to try and get the latest bit of information. But I know that, Andy, you're even more frazzled, maybe?
I got up at 4 this morning, Laurie. I looked outside, it was -8. I defrosted a car, drove to Manchester Airport, and then I flew to Barcelona to change planes to go to Morocco. So I'm in Barcelona Airport now. And when I landed in Barcelona Airport, my phone blew up. I'm sure you can both relate to that. And you expect it. It's part of your job. You know, it's just radio stations, it's news outlets. But the mad ones are your mates who know full well what your job is, just ringing for a chat about the managerial situation at Manchester United. I just had a number from Portugal, so that was the one I answered. I thought, okay, this could be an Amorim angle, but it was the national radio of Portugal.
I just said, Ruben Amorim calling you.
Well, I've not got his number in my phone, and I thought, you never know. And I said, I'd love to do it, but I'm changing planes in an airport. Then I snuck off to do this interview with you two.
We've only got limited time with you in this airport lounge, so let's just get into it. I'm going to read out the club statement. Ruben Amorim has departed his role as head coach of Manchester United. Ruben was appointed in November 2024 and led the team to the UEFA Europa League final in Bilbao in May. With Manchester United sitting 6th in the Premier League, the club's leadership has reluctantly made the decision that it's the right time to make a change. This will give the team the best opportunity of the highest possible Premier League finish. The club would like to thank Ruben for his contribution to the club and wishes him well for the future. Darren Fletcher will take charge of the team against Burnley on Wednesday. So, head coach mentioned in there, club's leadership has reluctantly made the decision that it's the right time to make the change. Laurie, you were on the phones last night after the podcast. You're chuckling. Can you explain this? Give me some context.
Well, I think the context is, I think reluctant is a reference to the point of, you know, ideally they wouldn't have had to make this decision, right? Because their reputations are wedded to it. You know, Omar Barada advocated for Ruben Amorim to come into the club when they were discussing replacements for Eric Ten Hag. Dan Ashworth, the sporting director, I think went for proposed managers that had Premier League experience, but this was a sort of big point of difference, I suppose. And you know, Ratcliffe went with Barada, you know, liked what he heard from Amorim as well. So it's very much on Ratcliffe as well, this decision. And then Jason Wilcox, you know, kind of got on board with it, you know, I think had some doubts about the back three system, but kind of came round to it and then had a strong relationship, we believe, with Amorim. But obviously that has deteriorated. And I think you can see that from Ruben Amorim's press conferences, from information that we get from, you know, people that we speak to in terms of the style of play. So we hinted at that, didn't we, in the podcast yesterday, where when does it become meddling and interfering? When does it become sort of dialogue with people, you know, in positions above you in terms of what formation are you going to play? And I think also throwing to that the transfers, you know, Antoine Semenyo, I think was a key point of contention this January transfer window. You know, United weren't able to convince him to come. And I think there's a bit more to say on that one that we'll get into in another time. But you've got, those two key instances there, transfers and the kind of perhaps interference from Amorim's point of view on his system. And that's why I think he referenced them in the Ellen Road sort of press conference. He mentioned recruitment department, sporting director, you do your jobs, I'll do mine. So it kind of felt like a territorial thing. But how much of that is then him calling it on with United? So in terms of them being reluctant to do this, once he said those kind of things, can you really allow this to continue in that kind of way? I thought maybe he said stuff like this before, right? He's kind of questioned his own status. He's questioned the players. He's called them out strongly. And they've kind of still supported him through that. I think the difference here is that he's obviously trained his sharp tongue, shall we say, on those above him, and ultimately they've then decided, well, this is untenable and we have to make that call. But yeah, I mean, it's mad, isn't it? In terms of reluctant, you do think results have been bad, right? I mean, really, 13 points, I think, from 9 games, something like that, in a favourable run. But they're still 6th. They're still in touching distance of the Champions League place. So this season is still alive. So yeah, big opportunity really for Darren Fletcher. I know it's starting with the Burnley game. Let's see how long it goes on for.
I mean, only 24 hours ago, we were talking about how Tuesday's press conference was going to give us a lot to go over, and everything's changed. Andy,
it still will. Darren Fletcher's press conference, that's the only difference.
Indeed. Andy, is this a case of calling out your boss, getting you the sack?
I don't think it did him any favours. Yesterday afternoon, I was waiting in the mix zone for a player to come through and no one was coming. So I walked into the main press conference room. I thought, if I can just catch Ruben Amorim, then... And I just caught him. I was speaking to Ben Thornley at the time and I just caught him. So I'm watching this press conference. I'm stood at the back. I didn't ask a question because I got into it late. And I'm just about to retrieve my phone, which is recording the press conference. It had been a pretty pedestrian press conference. He supported Benjamin Sesko. And then I think it was James Ducker from the Telegraph asked him one final question, and that's when he unloaded. I think if you're going to unload publicly against your bosses, which I was confused when he was saying it. I thought, what's he angling at here? I couldn't work it out. And then we tried to decipher it. That's our job to do that. Then you're putting yourself on very risky territory. Like Laurie and yourself, I spoke to people last night, but when I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning, I didn't, the lad who took me to Manchester Airport said he's going to go in here, and I'm like, I've got no evidence that he's going to go today. I just didn't know that until I changed planes. On Amorim, a little bit sad that it didn't work out. I think United fans were very invested into him. We can all have 20/20 vision after the event. Ultimately, the results have not been good enough. But as Laurie put into context, Manchester United are still 6th in the table, which is more or less on target for a European finish this year. The problem would have come if United do not reach that target. It would be a major, major problem if United are not in Europe next year. Revenue's not just from the competition, but from more games at Old Trafford, squad opportunities. We couldn't have another season like this one. That is the long and short of it. And when I spoke about transfers a few days ago, I said that the situation may look different at the end of January than the start of January. And if it's looking like United are not going into Europe at the end of January, I think United might be more likely to act than if Manchester United have got a winning form together. That's not happening. I think it's 3 wins in the last 10 games, but he is still 6th. And it's all happened pretty quickly for me. It was that press conference on Friday, and then it was a press conference after Leeds. I could not have seen this coming a week ago. There's tension around all the games and results. We've discussed this many times, the emotion of it all. I don't think too many fans will mourn his departure. I think there'll be some frustration that another manager has not worked out. I feel that he lost the moderates after Brentford away. That was in September. And then we entered new ground there, because normally within 3 or 4 weeks you're losing your job. But of course, fans getting angry, fans don't make the decision. And the club have finally made the decision. But if you start going against your bosses, and Laurie talked about the relationship with Jason Wilcox. Now, I've seen them two talking. They speak all the time. My understanding was that they had a productive relationship. I didn't hear any of them briefing against the other one. But clearly there's been a deterioration in that relationship. And the bosses have made a decision. And Ruben Amorim has lost his job. I feel like all these conflicting emotions now, like, okay, it wasn't working, let's move on to the next thing. I would laugh my socks off if Darren Fletcher plays 3 at the back against Burnley away. Sorry.
I can guarantee you one thing, he will not play 3 at the back. Imagine.
Right then. I mean, there's so much to go through.
Yeah.
I had one person text me saying, should I get the Fletcher twins into my fantasy football team for the Burnley game?
Well, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because he actually only took the 18s job once they progressed beyond that point. So it's now interesting that he kind of, accepting they're young players, right? So is he really going to rely on them straight away? But they've been knocking on the door. Yeah, interesting dynamic, that one.
Do you want to talk Fletcher? Do you want to talk about the bosses? Come on.
Ooh, thanks, Carl. I like this. Let's talk about Fletcher, maybe, just because his story has been fascinating at United, hasn't it? When you think back to, obviously, heralded player and, has won pretty much all you could win for United, clearly very knowledgeable about the game, has come through the illness that he had with, commendable sort of candour and also, resilience. And so then he comes back to United as a youth coach, kind of gets, into a very strong position as technical director, which I think, to be honest, was probably, too much at that stage in his career, alongside John Murtough as football director. He kind of was involved in the appointment of Erik ten Hag. He was in the interview process for that. And so then we come to, the coaching setup, and he then becomes a first team coach under Erik ten Hag. In fact, actually, I rewind a little bit. He was kind of in that role when Ralph Rangnick was the interim manager. So he was actually putting out a lot of fires when Rangnick was the interim manager, and you had a sort of very turbulent dynamic there. Then becomes a kind of more, I guess permanent, first team coach. That's kind of more his role under Erik ten Hag. And then, I think he, very credible person when you speak to players, when you speak to sort of agents and directors around the game. He's certainly somebody that comes across very well to me in terms of his knowledge of the game and the kind of the instinct for knowing what it takes at this kind of club, the scale of this club, also the elite level of football. So I think, for example, he was probably making recommendations around formation to Erik ten Hag, when he was having those kind of difficulties. And maybe you can ask the question, was Ruben Amorim getting that kind of sort of robust feedback from his coaching staff when clearly things were, have been going awry under him. So then clearly though, under Amorim, he wasn't having that kind of same role. He's got his own guys in, and this summer there was a decision to make. Do you want to take this under 18s job that's come up with Adam Lawrence departing? And I think, as I said earlier, he kind of felt that was maybe the right time to do so because his twin sons had moved beyond that age group, and this was an opportunity for him to step out on his own and perhaps start that managerial, trajectory. And now I think this has come a lot sooner than anyone would have anticipated, although I think he was clearly the obvious candidate if you were going to do an interim to come in because of the heritage that he's got, the pedigree, and clearly he's a safe pair of hands certainly for this. He'll be able to do a press conference, no problem. That's kind of, one of the aspects of having somebody as an interim in that is perhaps a question for some of them. But yeah, it's obviously not an ideal situation, and we can perhaps reflect more on Amorim's tenure as well as we go along in this podcast. But I think it's a really fascinating development that you've got Fletcher as the guy now who's going to pick the team. And, last time we had an interim manager who'd played for Man United, they did all right, didn't they, in terms of Ruud van Nistelrooy and even then Michael Carrick. So it's and then Ole Gunnar Solskjaer before that. It's kind of quite a few of these names. Let's see what team he picks. But I would put a lot of money on a back four being seen at Turf Moor. Sorry,
Andy.
My opinion of him, if that hasn't become clear in this podcast over the years, is very high. It's someone I've known for a long time. I think he did this job this year to be coaching a team day to day. Spoke to lots of people about him. The thinking was that he could be a top manager, and if he did a year at United with the 18s, then he moves on to a proper job. Like Michael Carrick went to Middlesbrough, for example, and I think Darren would have done that, but he's also always been very respectful to his family, and he's got 2 sets of twins. That's right. Okay.
So 4 kids, 2 sets of twins.
So that, if you're such a family man as he is, means that, you can't accept a job on the other side of the world. So I think living in Manchester has been good for him. I was saddened when Ruben Amorim, when he was cut out of being an influence with Ruben Amorim, there was some persuasion to make him take the 18s coach. Jason Wilcox was the conduit there. He's absolutely enjoying it. I think he's intelligent. Let's forget what he was as a footballer. He had a very, very good career. He's an absolute football geek, complete addict. The first time I met him like 20 years ago, he'd pull me up on stuff I'd written in 442 magazine. he just grilled me about Spanish football. He'd go to Spain in his spare time to watch games of Spanish football. I've spoke to him loads. You've seen me talking to him, Carl, and I just feel someone you can learn from, the way that he analyses a game, the way that he analyses opponents. I was speaking to him on Saturday. I went to Celtic Rangers, and he's a big Celtic fan. And, you know, tell me stuff. And he's just telling me micro details about players and their level. And I simply don't have the ability to do that because I'm not a professional football coach. And I love learning from people like him. And he was pulling out loan players from both teams. And I'm like, how do you know stuff like this? Oh, he's got dogs as well. He's got British Bulldog. And how much bandwidth have you got to be doing all of this sort of stuff? So I feel sort of excited because I'd love him to succeed. I think he could be the real deal, but it is only a caretaker role. We don't know how he's going to do. It's an extremely tough job. He may do what Michael Carrick said and just like, I'll do it for 3 games and enough's enough. Or he may think, you know what, it's only 3.5 miles from my house. I'll just give it a crack and see how we go. He does know that club very, very well. I think while he's not managed a top football team, he's not daft with the media. He's intelligent. My last book, I spent 4 hours with him at his home. And lots of people said that was their favourite chapter because his life story is pretty incredible. Not just his family's. One of his uncles was a saviour of Celtic in 1990. That was a man who became a millionaire out of agriculture in Ireland. He started life with nothing. And Darren grew up on an estate near Edinburgh and made a big success of his life. And he's tough as well. You know, when Sir Alex Ferguson was being a little bit indecisive when he was about to sign him, Darren held his own. He's like, listen, I've got 15 offers here, mate. He didn't call him mate, but he's very sure of what he says and who he is. Remember interviewing him in 2010. I'm thinking, that is absolute gold, everything you've told me. And then he saw me 2 months later. He's like, I gave you far too much there, didn't I? And like, yeah, but it's not my fault, is it? you did say it. So I think he's been around Manchester United a long time. He knows how the British media works. He knows every single one of those players. Remember in LA last year on the game, remember speaking to him, and he just went through every single player and gave details on how every single one of them had done. I'm like, I was at that game and I've not picked up 20% of what you're telling me. I wish him well. We've got this sort of confluence of emotions and positions now at Manchester United where Ruben Amorim, I'm sure we'll talk about him again closely in this podcast. We don't know how long Darren Fletcher's going to get, but I'm not uneasy about him steering the ship of Manchester United. And he's bright enough not to fall into cliches. He turned down loads of media stuff. He absolutely knows his own mind. He does have good friendships with some of the old players, but he's not going to be someone who harks back to how everything was great all the time. But he does know. You know, he's not a walking cliche. He's not a passion merchant. He's someone who has been in really responsible jobs at the club. You know, he was in charge of loans. He was in charge of Ahmad's loan. He was the contact who rang up Rangers, for example. When Garnacho went to Argentina, he was the man who rang the Argentinian FA and got set up face-to-face with the representative of the Argentinian FA. He said, I know you, Javier Mascherano. Mascherano speaking in English. He said, I knew you spoke English, because when they were fighting with each other on the pitch, Mascherano was always pretending he couldn't speak any English. So I sort of feel infused by it. I think we're due a bit of an upturn, a bit of happiness. But then I find myself thinking, are we looking for Ollie Mark II here? Do you know what I mean? I think he's just got there's some very good players at Manchester United. European qualification has to be a realistic aim for this season. And, you know, Manchester United might appoint another manager tomorrow and everything I said goes out the window. But you're asking me for my opinion right now.
Well, we will get our first instance of a Darren Fletcher press conference and more detail about that on Tuesday. Critch appears to be going. Let's go over the end of the Ruben Amorim football project. We've mentioned his name 2 or 3 times on this podcast already. Jason Wilcox. Laurie, this relationship between the two, it seems to have changed really, really quickly. What's Wilcox likely to be thinking or likely to be doing next?
It's likely to be thinking this is a highly pressurised situation. We need to get this right because there are now big questions, aren't there, for INEOS, for the whole regime, really, because this was such a big play by them. You know, I think everybody can understand the decision around Erik ten Hag, but then to keep him after sort of looking at other managers, you know, that doesn't go down well. And then the guy that you've hired, and I think we can all agree, you know, we wanted it to work, and there were certainly moments that it felt like it was going to. But this sustained sort of feeling of sort of turbulence around him has stalked the club. I know that the pre-season was felt positive, and it felt like he kind of like sat back into, right, now I can do this and I can get on board with it. But there's so many instances, aren't there, of kind of pretty wild situations. You know, you go back to the Brighton game, the Smash TV, the Grimsby defeat, you know, him, you know, calling the squad the worst in history, you know, that kind of thing. So it's been, you know, consistent that this has felt, you know, on the edge the whole way through. So, you know, how much due diligence was done to that end, and or was the due diligence done, and then they just thought, listen, this is something we need that kind of personality to lead Manchester United. You know, I'm told, like I say, that Wilcox, you know, did have some reservations about the back three system to begin with, but got on board with it and then developed, as Andy says, a sort of strong relationship with Ruben Amorim, speaking to him daily, you know, being that conduit with the hierarchy. Clearly something has gone awry in recent weeks. I mean, I did the report, didn't I, on Ruben Amorim telling his players that a change was coming in terms of the system and training with a 4-3-3. Now that's the system that Jason Wilcox, to my knowledge, you know, likes from his Manchester City days. And I think some of the youth teams actually at United have been playing that way with that in mind. So that's an interesting sort of subplot to this, perhaps. But yeah, clearly. So I thought that was Amorim doing that on his own accord, but I think perhaps it's become apparent that maybe there was some feeling from him that it was kind of required, and so, okay, I'll play the game a little bit perhaps, and we're doing a bit of an evolution on the system. But clearly there's been moments, you know, such as, I would say, you know, not putting 2 strikers up front, you know, to finish the Everton game, for example, you know, or the Wolves game, not showing that kind of tactical fluidity that I think certainly people at United would have liked to have seen. Yeah, what happened now though? Because, you know, United, okay, you put Fletcher in as an interim manager. Do you know, are you going to, you know, get the next one right? I think there's a lot of pressure now on, you know, Ratcliffe, on Barada, on Wilcox for getting this right. And I know that's easy for me to say from outside, and it's a difficult, you know, club to manage. Certainly there's lots of different personalities at play, and it's there's lots of financial complications as well to this, but I do feel that this is now a pivotal moment really for them to get this next path right, because, you know, United should be really challenging for, you know, the Champions League places, given that different clubs are having issues as well.
Do you think this could be a situation helped by one of Barada, Wilcox or others trying to come and speak to the fan base?
I'd always advocate that, right? I mean, obviously, I suppose they'd be a little bit tied by what exactly they can say. But I would always say there needs to be more than just the head coach speaking. I'm not saying that you need to have a regular press conference or anything like that, but just occasionally, let's hear from you. And I know Ratcliffe does that, obviously, does it, you know, with, you know, selective media, you know, United We Stand and others. But maybe that's part of the issue, you know, like Ratcliffe is very, you know, involved, shall we say. You know, he has opinions. You know, we saw him in the stands at Molineux, you know, very demonstrative with Jason Wilcox, you know, my brother sort of caught in the middle. And I think that is something to consider in all this as well. Maybe that's what Amorim's getting at in terms of him saying, you know, you've got your own responsibilities, I've got mine. I do think as well, his sort of reference to Gary Neville was an interesting one. I don't know if that's just him being a bit paranoid, or whether he seriously thinks that, you know, United would look at what Gary Neville was saying about his system, about his tactics on his podcast, and kind of use using that as forming their own opinions, but whatever. But yeah, I would always advocate for people sort of speaking openly, as much as they can, and then we can have these kind of, sort of robust conversations. But like I say, I appreciate there's some realities to that as well. But yeah, it just feels that I'm kind of sad, really. Like, for all the turbulence that's been going on, for all the people that have said correctly that this isn't good enough for Manchester United, I sort of felt that in the glimpses of Amorim being at his best, you could really get on board with him. Like, I came out of that interview with him in Chicago feeling brilliant. This is a guy that can really carry this, but clearly there's an emotion there to him that then when these kind of situations arise, he is justifiably not going to just take it. It's to his mind, but also he's going to voice it, and then it feels like Manchester United should not be doing anybody a favour, if that makes sense. Whilst at the same time, a guy shouldn't have to consistently say this is a privilege to manage this club. It felt like at times, Amorim, do you really want to be here? And that was an awkward look. So yeah, I've kind of just talked around there, Carl, but hopefully you can bring me back down to some sense of understanding with the next question.
Just about. Andy, you've nodded your head and scrunched up your nose 2 or 3 times at Laurie's answer there. So sounds like, 1, you would like a little bit more openness from the board, and 2, the Ruben Amorim period was odd.
I don't think history will remember it well, because I think we were just prepared for a takeoff that never came. It was patience and this hope of a brighter future, and he benefited from the fact that there's been too many managerial changes. And you're right that Laurie's right in that some of the glimpses were really encouraging. Is this the brave new world? Is he ahead of the game when he gets his players in? And we did see glimpses. But if you look at the statistics of how many games he won, it's nowhere near the level that Manchester United should be at. And that costs the club a lot of money.
Only Ralph Rangnick has a worse win percentage in the Premier League. He has the 6th worst win ratio out of all Manchester United head coaches and managers in the top flight. It talked about suffering a lot.
Well, people did suffer. The only thing that kept last season alive was the run in Europe. We've not got that this year. And that run in Europe, there were some fantastic moments. The Lyon game, the games against the Basques of Athletic Club. That final was a major concern, that Manchester United didn't have a plan B. That was costly in terms of confidence, in terms of finances, in terms of everything. That was an absolute horror result. And I vowed in November never to speak about that game again. But I'm just mentioning it for historical reference.
This could be the last time. This could be the final. This could be the soil on the coffin of that game. Could it, Andy? Where you're sort of, this is my final mention. Amorim's tenure is over. Don't need to go back there.
It just hurt. We were all hurting over that. I actually thought he was a very good communicator, and I was in the room with Laurie in Chicago, and we all came out of that thinking, that's a man who he looks good, he talks good. Only last week I asked him a question after the draw against Wolves, which was, we've won 1 in 5 at home, and 4 of the teams you failed to beat are in the bottom half of the table. And he gives like a really compelling answer. He didn't always do that. Sometimes I've got mixed messages in some of his answers, but it's also a very difficult job. I think you've got to cut anybody some slack there, and everything you're going to say is going to be overly scrutinised. I think Jason knows exactly what a successful football team looks like. He's not done it at a major club in the role he's at the moment, but I think he's someone who actually thrives under the pressure. I think his football career is actually underrated, winning the league with Blackburn Rovers, because he was never really on Manchester United's radar. And he did a lot of work at City, but I've spoke to him several times. I think he's smart. I think his and Fletcher's relationship is a decent one. But it's not just about him. Jim Ratcliffe exists, Omar Barada exists. These people in their mind are absolutely committed to making Manchester United successful again. I totally wish that happens. But then you have a blow up like Grimsby. Grimsby was an absolute stinking result. That was just on so many levels. Manchester United shouldn't have lost that, and I think that will be remembered as a low point. under Ruben Amorim. I wouldn't be surprised if Ruben Amorim is a very successful coach. I just wouldn't be. He's still young, and at times I think that inexperience has told, even in his dealings with the media. Did I or did I not say in the live show that I think he could be smarter with how he deals with the media? You know, no man is an island except him. He sort of cut himself off and very open and approachable, but just surrounded himself with a group of compatriots. And that had absolutely worked for him at Sporting. And you've got to respect that. People do stuff differently. I wish him well. It's a shame that it hasn't worked out with him. But I think this Manchester United soap opera, roller coaster, as it is this season, just leaves us being gripped for more. The club needs a little bit of a lift, though. I think he'd worked through most of the credit. I don't think there'll be outrage that he's gone. And I think he benefited from a huge amount of goodwill. You know, at the weekend I was speaking with someone who'd been with a Premier League manager who came to watch Manchester United's a game a few months ago at Old Trafford. I can't name him because it's not fair. He wasn't saying it. And he couldn't believe the support that Ruben Amorim was getting during an indifferent performance at Old Trafford. And he just said, at our place, we would simply not get this. And I don't blame Manchester United fans for backing the manager. But it would be nice if we can get closer to them sunlit uplands at some point in the next 5 or 10 years, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Look, our inbox is already bursting with comments. Please, if you have any thoughts, queries, or vents, email in devilspod@theathletic.com and we will eventually sift through it and read them out, possibly in a future episode. Laurie, I'm going to give you the final word here. How do you think this Ruben Amorim project will be remembered?
Sort of, wow, what was that? Like, ultimately, like, I would love to say something different, that it then turned, and you could see, as Andy's saying, actually he's ahead of the curve because back three and you've got these attacking wing backs, and you know it's actually a really dynamic formation, and it can really be aggressive. But ultimately we have to go back to the stats that you read out earlier, Carl. Was it 38% sort of win rate? It's just so far down, and I know that they came into a difficult situation, but they were still sort of within touching distance of the Champions League places even when he was appointed. You know, and I know then you're shifting things and you're trying to make a stand against certain behaviours that you want to alter, and I think that's a good thing. But yeah, how will it be remembered? Kind of rub your eyes. Okay, right, that happened. Let's see, you know, what else United can now become, really. What was good that's been left, and what can be worked on, and then, you know, what are the bits that are actually just, they were not worth the time. I do think it's interesting what happens with Kobe Mainoo now. You know, his future it felt to me very much aligned with Ruben Amorim. If he stayed, then I think Kobe would obviously want to leave. Now that he's not there, does that change things? You know, obviously he's got to get back to full fitness, so we'll see how much of a part he can play in the season to come. But I think there's certainly a lot of different strands now that are going to be picked apart, and what does that mean for individual players and the club as a whole?
A new year and new dramas for Manchester United. Well, thank you, listeners, observers, watchers. We'll be going through those strands. Whatever happens across the next couple of days, there is a football game against Burnley that we're going to have to sift through, and the press conference with Darren Fletcher on Tuesday we're going to have to go through too. We will be back sometime later this week. In theory, it's going to be Thursday morning with a post-Burnley episode, but you never know. You just never know. Here's an emergency podcast. I feel sorry for anyone who was partway through our previous one only to get a notification about what's happening here. Anyway, Andy, thank you for calling in from Airport Lounge. Laurie, thank you for, I mean, God knows what time you went to bed at. Pulling this all together, making phone calls. And thank you, everyone who's listening to this, for joining us as well. We will be back soon, whatever happens. Take care.
Thanks for watching this episode of Talk of the Devils. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you've not done already, like the video, and also get involved in the comments too, and click the bell to make sure that you never miss an episode with myself, Andy Mitten, Carl Anker, and Laurie Whitwell. There's also our social channels at TOT Devils on Instagram, X, and TikTok. Thanks for watching.